In today's video, we're going to continue our 2019 NHL offseason plan series, and we're discussing the Nashville Predators, and that's coming up next. Welcome back to Top Shelf Hockey. If you're new to the channel, thanks for stopping by. We review and discuss all 31 NHL teams, so if you're a huge hockey fan, consider subscribing and clicking the bell so you don't miss anything. Now, if you're new to this series, a couple quick things you're going to want to know. First of all, we divide these up into three segments. Segment 1, we're going to take a look at the 18-19 season and recap some of the top player and team statistics. Take a look at any changes the team went through throughout the season as well. Segment 2, we're going to take a look at the overall salary cap situation, any pending UFAs, RFAs, or any contracts they might need to tend to this summer. And then thirdly, we're going to discuss what changes this team needs to make during the summertime to be more competitive and move their team forward for next season. Now, also, if you haven't caught any of our other videos in this series, I am going to link a playlist up here in the YouTube cards. You can go check out the other remaining videos. We haven't covered all teams yet. There's still some left, but the team you're looking for is not there. Stay tuned. They'll be being posted here over the next little while to complete this series. Now, let's jump in with the 2018-19 season recap for the Nashville Predators. Now, as you can see here, the Predators had a pretty solid year, winning the Central Division, a 100-point season with a record of 47-29-6. Overall, things were relatively strong for the Predators. Unfortunately, things did not go well in the playoffs, but they're not the only division winner to have that happen to them. Obviously, the Nashville Predators are one of four, and that would mean all division winners go down in round one of the Stanley Cup Playoffs with a bit of an upset. And taking a look at some of the key team statistics here, including special teams and goals for and against, the Nashville Predators had the absolute worst power play in the NHL this year. 31st, 12.9%. It's amazing that they can have a 100-point season and win their division while being so bad on the power play, but yet they managed to pull it off. Their penalty killing, however, was excellent, 82.1% for sixth best. So obviously, overall, special teams were okay, but that power play definitely needs to be worked on for next year. That's a major down point for them. Goals for were not great, 240 for 19th best, so it kind of goes along with the power play. It wasn't just a power play situation. They did struggle more than they would like to score here for a team who had managed to win so many games. Obviously, they relied on strong goaltending and their top defensive play to get that done on a lot of occasions. Goals against was really solid like usual, 214 for third best in the league here. So obviously the Predators need to focus on scoring more goals, which will hopefully help their power play as well moving forward. Now let's take a look at some of their top individual performances, including their top goaltender and some of their top scorers. Now, the aging Pekka Rinne seems to be still playing really solid, only coming 1 year away from his Vezina Trophy season. Rinne still responded with a really good year here yet again with a record of 30-19-4. He put up a .918 save percentage and a 2.47 goals against. So certainly not enough to get into the Vezina Trophy conversation this year, but still a relatively solid season overall. They can't be too disappointed with that. Now, their top scorers, on the other hand, as we mentioned, this team struggled to score. So for a first place team to have such low numbers for their top scorers is a little bit unusual, but they certainly scored by committee with Nashville here. Ryan Johansson led the way with 64 points. Defenseman Roman Josi was second in scoring with 56. Philip Forsberg with 50 points. Victor Arvidsson put up 34 goals, but only 48 points. So obviously that's a little bit of a Cy Young here, 34 and 14 to get 48 points. But still, Victor Arvidsson is a very valuable member of this team, but he is more of a goal scorer than a playmaker. That is for sure. Now, a couple of their bigger names who certainly had terrible years, which I don't have on the screen there. PK Subban was down to 31 points. Certainly one of the worst years, actually might even be the worst year of his NHL career. And Kyle Turris, even though he did have some injuries, had a terrible year as well. He only put up 23 points. And both of those players are certainly have had a lot of talk about them in their futures with the club here moving forward. As far as any significant changes go with this team, they really didn't do anything too crazy throughout the year. They did make a few deals here near or at the deadline. They did trade young forward Kevin Fiala to the Minnesota Wild in exchange for Mikael Granlund. Obviously, that trade brings them Granlund, who's a pretty established, relatively good point-producing forward. So overall, even though I was a little surprised they traded the young Fiala, at least they got a pretty good return, and Fiala, I think, will be a pretty good fit in Minnesota. And of course, at the deadline, they also acquired forwards Brian Boyle and Wayne Simmonds. Boyle seemed to fit okay. They did give up Ryan Hartman in the Simmonds trade. Wayne Simmonds really never fit there and didn't really work out, and I definitely don't see him sticking around. But they did try to boost their lineup here at the deadline, but unfortunately, things did not work out and ended up with a first-round exit. Now let's take a look here at segment 2, where we look at their contract situation and their overall salary cap situation to manage all that. Now, as you can see, the list with the Predators is not overly long. They've done a pretty good job over the years here to get a lot of their younger players locked up longer term. So overall, they don't have a lot of contracts renewing from year to year, but they do have a couple of key RFAs that they're likely going to want to keep and make sure they get signed to decent deals here. And that includes Colton Sissons, who at times certainly played up in the lineup and had a pretty solid year for them. And also youngster Rocco Grimaldi certainly at times showed his value as well. So I'm sure that both those guys will be qualified and re-signed without much trouble. Now on the UFA side, it's kind of debatable here. I'm not sure we can say with any certainty that any of these guys will return. Obviously, Wayne Simmons, I think, likely does go somewhere else for sure. You get Brian Boyle, I can see maybe coming back, and I stress maybe on a short-term contract. Brian Boyle could play in Nashville. He could play elsewhere as well. Obviously, he's had a lot going on with his personal life and personal health and all that. So I'm not really sure for him from a personal standpoint where he would prefer to play. But I can see them at least talking to him, being interested, and maybe bringing him back on a short-term deal. Then you have Zach Ronaldo and Cody McLeod, both of which I could see likely heading elsewhere. I don't think the team really needs to keep either of those guys around. The key part of contracts for the Preds this summer is going to be extensions, including their captain, top defenseman, Roman Josi, who needs a big-time extension, is likely going to be long-term and expensive. So that's certainly very important for them to get themselves situated here. And, of course, Mikael Granlund, who came over from Minnesota, and Craig Smith could possibly be extended as well. I think they're a little bit less likely to that for sure that's going to happen. They very well might let the season play out and maybe start talking to them maybe in the second half of the year or towards the end of the year into this, once we get to this time of year next year. Not quite sure how that's going to go and what David Poile's plans are for either of those players. Now, from a salary cap situation, they do have 21 contracts in place for next year, so they really don't need to have a whole lot of players re-signed here. Obviously, like the RFAs we discussed, but the UFAs could all leave. They're not necessarily players that they have to keep. Those 21 contracts value $75.8 million, so based on the cap, likely going up to $83 million. That gives them just over $7 million in cap space to work with. So obviously with that Roman Josi extension, likely going to be expensive. There's been a lot of talk. They might have to move some salary out as well, which we'll get into here in the next segment. So now that we've covered all that, what do the Predators need to do and how can this team get better for next year to get back to their ultimate goal, to go back to the Stanley Cup Finals and win a Stanley Cup? Obviously, they competed for the Stanley Cup a few years ago against the Penguins and have yet to be able to make it back ever since they had that opportunity. Of course, that year they were a wildcard team and had an unprecedented run that many of us could not have predicted. And really ever since, they've been having better regular seasons, but less success in the playoffs. Now, if you take a look at this past year, like I said before, this team can't score enough. And really, to get far in the playoffs, you need to have some dynamic scorers. And I just don't think this team has it. I'm not convinced Ryan Johansson is a number one center iceman. I think he'd be better off being a number two. Obviously, they had traded to bring in Kyle Turris to be that number two guy behind Johansson, and he's not working out, at least not yet. There has been some talk he could be traded, and I personally don't see it happening just because he's coming off a major down year. So trading that contract where he signed for 6 years at $6 million, and he's only a year into it, I think will be quite difficult. David Poile has shown in the past that he's not the kind of GM that likes to retain salary. So even though they'd probably be interested in trading Turris, I'm just not sure that it's going to happen. But they need a more dynamic scorer in that lineup to play in their top six. And there's a couple of different ways they can go about getting it. And one might mean trading the $9 million defenseman PK Subban. That defense core that the Predators have as the top four, especially with Josi, Ellis, Ekholm, and Subban, are pretty darn good. They're one of the better blue line cores around the NHL, but we all know it's just a matter of time before they have to break up that core on the blue line and move one of them out. And to me, Subban makes the most sense. He doesn't have any trade protection in his contract, so it makes it easier to move him for starters. Secondly, he is the most expensive, so it frees up the most space. And if you look at the other guys here, they're not going to want to trade their captain, Roman Josi. He's too important to that team. And I do think longer-term contracts that were just put in place for like Ryan Ellis, they're not going to turn around and trade him after signing him to a mega deal last year. Then they got Ekholm as well, which is a much more affordable deal than Subban. So in my opinion, there's no guarantee they trade Subban, but I do think there's a pretty good possibility that they will use him to obtain a top scoring forward to come back and help them on the forward group here, because that's what they really need. Subban had a down year as well, so trading him now isn't the best idea in a sense, because you may not get that full value like you could have before, but I think most people around the league know what he's capable of, and getting him into a different lineup that's a little bit more offensively minded might be the best thing for him to kind of rejuvenate his career and kind of get his point totals back to what we were used to in the past. Now, obviously, locking up defenseman Roman Josi is at utmost importance. They don't want to let him go to free agency. He's very important. As you can see, he was their second leading scorer. He's a pretty good captain, good leader for them on that blue line, and I see them getting that deal done. I've heard David Poile say before that was priority number one this offseason as well. So I fully expect that to happen. They already started talks here now that the World Championships tournament was over, because Josi did go over play for Switzerland in that tournament, and it was reported that as soon as that was done, they were expected to begin negotiations and get things going. So we'll see how that goes. I don't expect it to be too difficult, but Josi is going to be due a fairly substantial raise, and they obviously need to make room in some capacity. Obviously, you normally look to your players that are struggling to move out, but at the same time, like I said, with Turris and Subban, after having down years, they might be the most difficult to move. It's also been reported here before, and we've discussed it back a few weeks ago, that they might be interested in going after free agent center iceman Matt Duchene. Now, Matt Duchene had a pretty terrific year in Ottawa. Of course, was traded to Columbus, had a bit of a slow start, but then looked good near the end and had a pretty solid playoff run. And I think that it would make a lot of sense for them to go after a guy like Duchene, but I don't see them having the need to go Duchene, Johansson, and Turris. So personally, if they're going to sign Duchene as a free agent, then either Turris or Johansson need to go, and I'm sure they'd probably prefer to trade Turris. But like I said before, that might be difficult to do. But Matt Duchene loves Nashville. He loves country music, as we all know. He has investment properties in Nashville. He does go there a lot during the offseason, during his off time. It's just a place he loves to visit and hang out. So it's not a complete shocker to know that he would certainly be open to playing there. But unless they are able to move some money out, it certainly would be kind of difficult for them to acquire a guy like him and take on the contract that he's going to be demanding. Unless they do trade PK Subban, but not get a scoring forward that way. If they could trade Subban for maybe for more future, like prospects and picks and that type of thing, free up some space and then sign Duchene, that would be the only way, in my opinion at least, that they could probably get that done and make it a realistic venture here. But like I said, Subban likely is the main trade bait piece that goes out to accomplish that, either to make room to sign Duchene or to bring back another forward who could do a similar type of thing. But I do think having a scoring winger might prove just as good as well instead of going down the Duchene route. But I know they're interested in that, so they certainly need to add scoring regardless of how they do it. The power play was abysmal. The scoring as a whole, 5-on-5, wasn't great either. If this team really wants to compete for a Stanley Cup, they need a top scorer in their top six who can be a weapon that they can count on to put in the big goals when it matters most. And they don't have that right now. So to be taken real seriously, for me at least as a cup contender, that's what they need to do. Their goaltending is pretty solid. Pecorine is still under contract. He's certainly playing at a pretty good level still. They have Saros backing him up, who's pretty solid as well. Even if they move Subban, they still have a pretty good defense core. They got Dante Fabro, who can step in and take up more minutes. Fabro's a pretty great young-looking defenseman so far, so I think they'll be okay that way. And overall, I like their forward group for the most part. They're just missing that one dynamic player to really put them over the top, to be more of a threat. So let me know your thoughts and your opinions down below in the comment section. What do the Nashville Predators need to do? Can they get back to the Stanley Cup Finals and still compete for a Stanley Cup? Or is their window closing? And how do they go about making sure it stays open a little bit longer so they can bring that cup down to Smashville? Let me know your thoughts and opinions down in the comments, and we will continue the conversation. If you're new to the channel, I hope you consider subscribing. We cover all 31 NHL teams, and there's plenty of content here for all hockey fans to enjoy. So if you're new, subscribe for more videos in this series. There's plenty more coming soon as we aim to wrap this up over the next little while. Thank you very much for watching, and I will catch you next time.